exactly what it is, because oftentimes the term blockchain is used somewhat loosely in the industry. And I mean, I will tell you that I think it was last year sometime, there was a company that literally changed their name. I can't remember what they did, but all of a sudden they became, you know, company XYZ, and then they added blockchain to the end of their name, and all of a sudden their valuation went up because people were so enthralled with the fact that, oh, they're doing something with blockchain, it must be something cool. But so what I hope to do initially in this discussion, and then we'll develop it further with, you know, some of the questions that may come from the audience, is, you know, what the heck is a blockchain? What I'll illustrate first here is that, you know, what I'll call an exchange of value. And they're going to exchange value with these units. I say they're 25 units. And maybe the most elementary way to look at it is, you know, pretend maybe that this is nothing more than a bank ledger, if you will. So they're logging into a bank ledger that they all have accounts with. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bank ledger. It could be something else. As some of you know, I'm an author. Maybe I've set up, you know, some incentive token points or whatever. If you buy my book, I'll give you an X number of incentives. You can come to one of my events, or you can buy merchandise with it. It really doesn't matter what it is. Just imagine that it's something that where people are exchanging value. And in this particular case, we'll start off with something that, you know, maybe more people would relate to, which is money. So I show some different transactions here. The first one, you know, say David starts out with a balance of 25. He sends Nora 5, and then his end balance is 20. Krista does the same thing. Nora's feeling pretty good about now because she's got some extra money. Then she decides to send something back to David, and then it shows her new balance. And then to kind of round out, David sends some amount back to Krista, and then this review what just happened. Let's say physically they logged into a site. In this particular case, it's going to be a bank ledger. You know, they each authorize their login. You know, they got a password, maybe a PIN number, and so forth. They were able to access their account, and they were able to send money. And again, here in a very simplistic way, within the same bank ledger. So we'll just use Midwest Bank Center as an example. They all had an account at Midwest Bank Center, and they all sent money, some value to each other. This could have been my website for my author site. It doesn't really matter where it is. They're exchanging value. So what I'm going to ask everybody is, what allowed these transactions to even happen in the first place?
Trust.
Trust. What else?
System.
A system.
Process.
A system and a process.
An organization.
An organization. All great answers. The one I'm going to really focus on is the one that Debbie said, trust. Because this can't happen unless there's trust. Who, in this particular case, who guarantees that trust? Okay. In this particular case, it'd be the bank, right? Or in the case that, you know, people are wanting these unit values, these tokens from my author site, it would be me, right? Or whoever's running my website. They've got to make sure that these balances are correct, right? But there's also something else that has to happen in these transactions, and that is the first time when I said David sent you know, Nora 5 units. Well, we have to make sure that it really was David that was sending something to Nora, right? I mean, he can't fake his identity. He's got to be able to verify his identity. We also have to be able to verify that David actually has 5 units that he can send to Nora, right? So we have trust in the system, and that trust provider ensures that the identity is correct, that the balance, if you will, of the individual is correct, and that they can actually do this transaction. The key point to remember about this slide is not the individual transactions that happen, but like you said, Debbie, it's trust. We have trust in the system, we had identity verification, and we also had, let's say, balance verification, so we can't, you know, David can't double spend, you know, these amounts that are on here. You can't say, okay, I got the 5 units that I sent to Nora, I'm going to try to spend those same 5 units again to send to Krista as an example, right? So then his balance is off. So those are really key elements to have in the system. When we have a system like this, it's in one location, it's i.e. centralized, okay? And everything that happens occurs through that system. One of the things that we have had plague us in technology here in the last few years is the whole issue of security. Anybody here remember Equifax? Right? Everybody's laughing, right? What does Equifax have? Equifax has something like this. They have a ledger in a centralized location that has your name, your social security number, birthday, who knows what else, right? That got hacked. But we, merchants, banks, other credit institutions, they use institutions like Equifax because, okay, here's a centralized depository with all this information, but we trust that, Equifax takes good care of that information, they're a good steward of that information, that it's not subject to hacking, right? So there's that. Anybody here ever use Facebook, right? We had some issues with Facebook where people's privacy concerns were violated because there was some information that got released that shouldn't have been and so forth. So another central point, not to sound redundant, about this example here is that everything's centralized, it's in one location. But you also have a lot of responsibility that you're placing in that trust provider to make sure your identity is secure, okay? Let's bring up another example. Midwest Bank Center, we'll pick on them, or let's use my website as an example. And I conferred, these 25 units of value to David because, he bought all my books, But you know what? I got mad at David because when he read the novel 2020, he gave me a 1-star review on Amazon. So now I'm pissed at David, right? So now all of a sudden I went in there and I monkeyed with David's balance, and instead of having 25 units, I'm going to penalize you, and now you only have 15. David's not happy, right? And I bring that example up as a very elementary example, but when you also have a centralized trust authority, what do they also have? They have a lot of potential power. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily that in the case of a bank, that a bank's going to arbitrarily take money away from you, but let's take this discussion one step outside of our orb here, and let's look at geopolitics. Now, imagine that these transactions are, transactions that occur at a country level, and you've got one country that's mad at another country and says, okay, you know what, we're going to freeze your balances here, so David, you can't send, well, you still have your 25, but we're not going to let you send it to anybody right now, because geopolitically, you've done something that has made us angry, okay? We have real life examples of that in the world. There's something called a SWIFT network, which is a communications network that's used by banks to transmit messages to one another. It's used primarily in the transfer, international transfers that are occurring. There is one entity typically that controls that, and happens to be the United States. And what the United States can say is, okay, if we're mad at a particular country, we can freeze them out of the international finance system, right? And if you as a country get frozen out of the international finance system and you can't sell your goods and services overseas, you got a problem, right? You're looking at some of the reasons maybe why some people would say, we need something that moves away from this centralized trust authority, an authority that can exert absolute control potentially on my assets or other value that I have, right? And we talked about the security aspects as well. We've had many instances of things being hacked that are centralized. So how do we potentially get away from something like that? And so that kind of gives you a flavor as to the why of the blockchain and why the blockchain is created in the first place. And we'll have a situation where David sent the 5 units of value to Nora, and Krista did the same thing over here. So the difference here is that there is no body in the middle, so to speak. This happened pretty organically through the World Wide Web. Everybody uses the World Wide Web, and we've been able to exchange the value. What do we need to have in order to make this work? Okay. The thing here in this block are all the transactions that we had showed earlier, and now what we have is, let's imagine a situation where we have all of these different players that want to be able to exchange value with one another. Again, it could be money, it could be people that maybe have tokens on my website for value they want to exchange for whatever. And these people now are going to participate in the same exchange scheme that we were talking about earlier, but in order to establish something that everybody will use, let's go back to what some of the things that are required. You mentioned trust. this can't work unless everybody trusts what's going on. Would you everybody agree with that? I mean, you're not going to dive into something like this, especially with these dudes right here, unless you know, unless you trust what's going on. We also have to be able to verify that David had 5 units to send to Nora, that Krista had 5 units to send to Nora, and so forth. So we have to have the same elements that we had before. It's just that now we have to architect it differently. And more importantly, if you notice, we don't have anything in the middle, if you will, like before, like that centralized database in order to do all this. So how do we accomplish this? Let's just use, and there's different types of blockchain. Last month we were talking about the Bitcoin blockchain. Let's just go to that blockchain because it's the most ubiquitous and most used and so forth. In a Bitcoin blockchain, one of the things that has to happen is, again, we have to go through that verification process of identity, trust, and so forth. There are people, if you will, entities in this network, if you will, and when I say the network, just people that are participating in this whole scheme, that are, examining the transactions, they're looking at it. You got, these 2 other dudes here, and you got these people that look like they're, with the pick and so forth. They look like miners because that's really what they're doing. And so what's happening with some of these entities that are playing around this is they're, verifying the transactions. They're making sure that David has what he says he has. They're making sure that David is who he says he is. And for all of this purpose, we need to be able to provide an economic incentive for these players, if you will, to be part of the scheme, because they're not necessarily going to do it out of the goodness of their heart. Now, there are other players, like some of these people that are with the magnifying glass, that they like to be part of this. They may not be compensated economically like the miners are going to be, but they have a great incentive to make sure that this process continues to work over and over again, is repeatable, and that everybody trusts what's going on. So what we have here is kind of the general gist of the first part of the blockchain. So here's all of the data that's occurred, and then you've got, let's call them the watchdogs, the trust entities that are around here. Now, you might be asking the question, well, why should I trust, these dudes here? Why should I trust the guys with the picks, and the guy with the magnifying glass? Well, part of it is you don't necessarily have to trust them. You have to trust the system. You have to trust the protocol. In this particular case, the blockchain is the Bitcoin protocol, or the Bitcoin blockchain. There are other blockchains that establish, those same trust parameters, but that's who we trust, okay? We don't trust, I should say, that's what we trust. We don't necessarily have to trust these dudes, we have to trust the math. And I have engineering degrees in math I trust, and usually I don't like to use the words never or always, unless I'm talking about things that are mathematically related. Well, what's happening here is a significant amount of math in the background that we won't necessarily get into. Yeah.
What motivated somebody to want to create this decentralization? Because it seems as though the premise is decentralization is good and centralization is bad. All right?
Well, it's like we talked about at the very beginning, is to have a system that didn't have that central authority, where you didn't have to trust that central authority. From a practical perspective, I'll just give you some examples of things that are going on right now. I think if you follow what's going on in current events, you're familiar with what's going on in the country of Venezuela right now, right? A lot of chaos, a lot of financial chaos. What would you say to somebody in Venezuela that said, that you told them, okay, your country's currency is called the Bolivar, and by the way, that currency is like hyperinflating, right? You've been isolated from the rest of the world. You're constantly losing value because you keep holding this note that your government says it has value. A lot of those people have been able to save their value, right? Because they converted some of this, maybe to US dollars. But sometimes what's difficult with the US dollar is to maybe move it out of the country. If you've got an account, let's say in Venezuela, let's say you convert it to US dollars, like, oh, I want to send this to Midwest Bank Center in St. Louis, Missouri. Well, the Venezuelan government can stop that in a heartbeat, right? If you are carrying around a lot of physical, Benjamins with you, cash, those green pieces of paper, that could be a problem too. From a security perspective, maybe you get checked at the border and the border agent says, what do you have in that duffel bag? Oh, sorry, get back in the country, you can't do that. So it provides a certain amount of portability. The use cases are probably more difficult, David, I would say, to identify for certainly the people in this room. Why? Because we constitute the small minority of people, not in the United States, but worldwide, that even are bankable and have a bank account. And part of the problem with that is, one of the things, well, here, I'll ask Jessica, if somebody comes to Midwest Bank Center to open up a bank account, what do they need? Besides money.
Identification.
Identification. Yeah. Many places in the world, people don't have adequate identification. You see, they can't show up to a bank and, oh, I'm going to open up a bank. Oh, can I see your ID? I don't have one. I know it sounds crazy, right? So some of the what I'll call more practical uses of blockchain right now, and I'm sure Xavier can add more with some of the things that he's doing with blockchain. I think for the average person to identify like what I'll call a common practical use case now, where you're thinking, well, why would I want to deviate from a centralized authority? Probably don't rise to the surface here as much, because again, we have these conveniences. We are bankable, we have identification and so forth. So I think that's, and we'll get into a little bit more about kind of a hybrid with these blockchains, the difference between what I'll call a permissioned blockchain, where you need permission to participate, and a permissionless. When we did this example here, no one needs permission to join this, right? I let these two dudes, I don't even know who these two dudes are, they have some crazy looking hair. But I let them join, right? Or actually, I should say, nobody let them join, they were just able to join, right? So that's the difference between the two types of blockchain. Let's talk about how we would form a block, if you will, and then we use Bitcoin blockchain once again. These were all the transactions that we talked about at the very, very beginning that occurred when we had that ledger and that spreadsheet looking thing. What we're going to do right now is we're going to say, okay, well, we have to trust that these transactions really could happen. So we mentioned that David really has to have 5 units that he can send to Nora and so forth. David has a valid account. That's really David who's sending that. And then we group all of these things, these transactions together, and we organize them in something called a block. But in order to create this block, we have all these different transactions that we group. And what I want to focus your attention on is this thing up there that's expanding. It's called a hash, and it's called hash 1. And that's a value that is created based on computations that occur with each one of these transactions. A hash is a mathematical function which basically takes a string of characters, string of data, if you will, and outputs it in a fixed length. Let me give you a practical application of what a hash function even does. You guys would probably have, we're back to that centralized thing where you log into a site and it asks you for your password, you type it in and so forth. But maybe one time you forgot your password, and if you think, okay, well, I'm going to call customer service, and they're going to tell me what my password is, and then I can type it in, maybe after some proof of identity and so forth. Well, a lot of passwords, maybe most passwords these days, aren't actually stored that way. When they tell you they can't tell you what your password is, they can only reset it for you, or you reset it yourself. The reason is because they don't actually ever store your password. What they do is they take your password, they run it through this mathematical function called a hash, and then what actually gets stored on their computer is this fixed string of numbers, right? And so what happens is that next time you log in, you put in your password, it runs through this mathematical hash function and says, oh, does that thing compare equally to what we already have stored? If the answer is yes, they're good to go. Okay? That's a pretty common use of something called a hash. But why it's important here, and back to that whole trust thing, is we have to make sure that all of these transactions were valid. Here, this hacker, if somebody wanted to go back and change, one of these transactions, David hired a hacker and said, hey, can you reverse that one transaction so it makes it seem like I never really sent Krista, those 5 units. If that hacker tried to do that, because of the math that's involved here, it would change a bunch of things that eventually would change that number there that at the top is called hash 1. And once that gets changed, then it irretrievably breaks the continuity, if you will, of everything that's already happened. And so what's happening with this, and you'll see on another slide, is since all this isn't in one central place, people have different copies of this. Somebody will say, well, wait a second, my hash value says this, but yet this block that this miner created says this, and it doesn't equate, so this block never gets accepted. So that, what I want you to leave you with here is that hash up there at the top is a very, very important thing. And then how you create the chain, so you have all these blocks, you create the chain because you link these blocks together with that hash value. So